Welcome, everyone. My name is Veena Najibola. I'm the Vice President of Research and Strategy here at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you all to the first event of this school year, as we like to say. So happy September to everyone. Lovely to see so many old friends, but also new colleagues and friends joining us from various industries here in BC, as well as BC government, consular generals. It's wonderful to see you all, and of course, all of my colleagues from the Asia-Pacific Foundation. I should note, of course, that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And of course, we are grateful to the Indigenous people in Canada for their stewardship of the lands on which we live, work, and play. Many of you are familiar with the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, but of course you know that our mandate is to work on Canada-Asia relations, to deepen understanding, awareness, and ties between Canada and the economies and countries of the Indo-Pacific region. We do this through a number of things, including events like this one. Today we're focusing on critical minerals, Canada's strategic position on critical minerals, and building resilience across the Pacific. Like many other organizations over the last couple of years, especially since the launch of the Canada's critical mineral strategy, as well as the Indo-Pacific strategy in 2022, we have seen that a lot of our work is beginning to intersect and cover this issue of critical minerals. They're important when it comes to our economic security, our defense production, even geopolitics. And of course, from our perspective, we're looking at how Canada looks at this issue when it comes to the Indo-Pacific engagement, both opportunities with partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, even increasingly India, but also obviously challenges and complexities of China as the most dominant player in critical minerals' entire value chain and supply chains. We also specifically look at investments and trade, particularly, so I would commend to you our recent publication on this, looking at critical minerals investment flows between Canada and the Indo-Pacific region, which the team kind of did on the basis of our own data and data sets. So I would definitely recommend that you take a look at it. And it looks at the last 5 years of investment flows at a fairly granular level, including at the subnational and even municipal level. So for those from BC, you might find that interesting. And of course, in addition to that work, we're also seeing how this issue is being used sort of on the world stage, the G7 and the positioning of Canada as a reliable provider of critical minerals to allies and partners, sort of the various multilateral initiatives that Canada is taking place and what that means for our dialogue and ongoing engagement in Asia as well. So because there's such a demand, we are very excited to be launching a dedicated work stream for this issue. So it's no longer kind of happening on an ad hoc basis, but rather that we establish the Canada Indo-Pacific Critical Minerals Hub. So today is a very soft launch of that initiative. A lot more will come in the months ahead, but we wanted to use particularly this discussion and the expertise of our two distinguished speakers, whom I will introduce in 1 second, to launch the hub, to kind of explain a little bit what we hope to do through this hub and really solicit your ideas and inputs on what the focus of the hub's activity should be. What we imagine right now is obviously a focus on applied research, so policy relevant research, evidence-based analysis of state of play, particularly vis-a-vis China. We feel that there is a need to right-size the challenge and the threat, to understand both kind of the nature of China's dominance, how it happened, why it happened, the kind of the 2-decade lead that China has, as well as some of its vulnerabilities and some of the interdependencies that still exist. So right-sizing the China challenge. The next element is being able to have kind of a clear understanding of Canada's ambition. And I guess there it would be set of prioritization, sort of given the challenge and given limited resources, where can Canada really prioritize its efforts? So specific initiatives, policy recommendations, how it fits into the broader conversation on industrial policy, on industrial strategy, economic security, and so forth. And then the final element of it, of course, would be understanding U.S. dynamics, especially the changes that are happening happening at a dizzying speed under the Trump administration. I think by my count, we have 5, maybe 6 dedicated executive orders on critical minerals just in the last few months. So, and of course, all of them have implications for Canada, both in terms of investment opportunities as well as how we then position ourselves vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific. So kind of research on all of those topics, convening of these kinds of discussions, really leveraging the fact that APFC has stakeholders and is accountable to government, academia, and private sector. We're uniquely positioned to bring all of those voices and sectors together for these kinds of discussions, to be able to share ideas. So research and convening are critical elements, and of course then policy engagement and public engagement. So that's kind of the concept behind the hub. We're excited to be doing this in partnership with the University of Ottawa, which is why Dr. Pascale Massot, Professor Massot, is here with us. And of course, she has been leading a lot of the discussions on understanding China, its political economy, its positioning in the commodities market, as well as what that means for Canada, both as an academic expert, but also as someone who's worked in government most recently a couple of years ago with Minister Champagne and others. And of course, she is the author of the wonderful book, which I hope all of you have seen and have read, which is China's Vulnerability Paradox, which looks specifically at China's placing in the commodities markets. She will speak a lot more to that. And because we want these discussions to be very much also grounded in the industry perspective and the views of people who are actually working in this field, in the mining sector, as well as businesses who are trying to raise capital, we want to this discussion, but also moving forward, always have that voice. So we're absolutely thrilled to have Constantine Karayannopoulos. Failed that test. I was practicing all morning, and he even gave me tips on how to say that. So we will get there by the end of the session. But Constantine has been a leader in this field for 30 years, has been CEO and a board of director on a number of companies focusing on critical minerals and rare earth. He now says he's on his 3rd attempt of retiring, but continues to be an active voice and advises a number of companies, including in places like Brazil and in Asia, and here, of course, in Canada. And we're absolutely thrilled to have him here with us. He's a constant commentator on these issues, really thought after keynote speaker. So I'm absolutely thrilled that we were able to persuade him to fly from Toronto to join us for this event and to be part of discussions and part of shaping kind of the direction of this effort and this initiative at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. Now, in terms of the structure of today's event, we are recording this, but I want to assure both our speakers and also everyone in the room that we will only use portions of it, and if there's anything that you don't want, if you choose to speak and don't want that to be recorded and used in the future, that is completely fine. We will honor that because we do want to have a robust discussion, but we also want to be able to use parts of the discussion to promote the initiative and the launch of the hub. So that's kind of the reason for, this is not live stream, but the reason for all the recording and both the audio and the video is to be able to use parts of the material for our future purposes, but we will honor anybody's wish to not be included in those promotionals after the fact. So I hope that is fine. And so we have about 90 minutes together. I'll, of course, turn first to our 2 speakers to get their opening remarks and some scene setters for the conversation. But then I also want to bring in all of your perspectives to talk about what they share, but also, like I said, kind of looking at those 3 buckets of issues, really understanding Canada's ambitions in this area and sort of maybe being able to kind of get from ambition to concrete action, then right-sizing the China challenge, and then looking at what is the impact of the recent U.S. policies on Canada moving forward, all with a view to practical recommendations moving forward. So I think that's probably enough from me for just as a way of introducing the conversation and our speakers. You have their bios also, obviously, in the invitation to this event. So like I said, we're absolutely thrilled to have both of them here. I will turn first to you, Pascale. Thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vina. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And thank you also to the Asia-Pacific Foundation's other many colleagues who are here, Erin, Karen, others who will support this project, and Vina for having seen the value of this initiative at this time. I think, we are in a moment where natural resources have been elevated again to the sort of height of geopolitics. Perhaps, for the first time since maybe the commodities supercycle of 2007, or even the oil crisis of the 1970s, right? We're back in this world. And both President Trump's focus on the issue and President Xi's response on April 4th have really changed the nature of the game. Echoing Vina's introductory remarks here, I think that, for folks in the West, we are really sort of building the plane as we fly it, trying to react very fast, as over the past decades we had really seen resource security through the lens of open markets and sort of a globalization lens. Whereas China, on the other hand, for many decades, always really has seen resource security from a security lens. And so we're sort of in this space where we're trying to adjust very, very quickly, and we will fail as much as we will succeed, I guess, in this process. I think that why, this initiative is also really important at the Asia-Pacific Foundation here, why APF is a great place for it, is that when an issue is securitized very rapidly, I feel like there are disconnects between pools of expertise. So in Canada, we have great expertise in mining, great engineers, the whole finance industry, local community engagement, indigenous consent, et cetera. But the community who focuses on security and geopolitics and China is not the same, right? So we need a place to connect both these worlds. The people who know mining don't necessarily know China, and the people who know Asia, Indo-Pacific, et cetera, don't necessarily know mining. Hoping that this can serve as a bridge, right? So let me address Vina's first, question about right-sizing the challenge. On the China dominance side, I think that we've seen a lot of numbers in the press. In the West now, we're sort of used to thinking about China as being dominant, but I don't think that we have enough of a sort of granular understanding of the nature of China's dominance and how it got there, both in terms of supply chains and value chains, actually. In terms of global supply chains, China is dominant not only because of low regulatory environment or such, but really a multifaceted, decades-long strategy that had very strong domestic and international components. I was looking at, trying to find numbers because, to compare our Canadian sort of $4 billion critical mineral strategy. Not that Canada can never compare in terms of financial heft with China, but just to give us, a sense, there's an aid data project at Williams and Mary that has calculated almost $60 billion of aid and credit, only natural resource focus for China over the past 20 years around the world, and around 50 billions of investment in China in 2023 alone, domestically for the mining industry, just to sort of give us a sense of the scale of numbers we're talking about. But in terms, the space that we sometimes miss in public debates is the value chains aspect. And there, of course, China has established strong positions in the midstream segments, but not only in the midstream segments, in the whole sort of ecosystem, industrial ecosystem aspect. Of course, it does control, we've seen, as I said, those numbers, 2/3 of global refining processing in many critical minerals, over 90% for rare earths. But did you also know that between 2020 and 2024, China has added almost all of the growth in refined metals production? So all of the additional refining midstream segments capacity over the past 5 years, say, almost all, when I say almost all, for cobalt, 97%, for rare earths, 96%, for graphite, 98%, for copper, 83%. So even as we try to figure things out, China's also not sitting idly. Idly?
Idly.
Idly.
You can say it in French.
Another way to look at the scale of the challenge here is to have a look at the EU Critical Raw Materials Act, which I think is interesting because of their effort to put numbers on ambitions, which we haven't done. I don't think any other critical mineral strategy actually does. So the EU numbers its objectives. And those objectives have been called as too ambitious by many from inside the industry, but nevertheless, the EU targets 10% of domestic capacity by 2030, and no more than 65% of consumption from a third country, a single third country. If we just think about this for a minute, it could mean that, the EU is relying on imports for 90% of consumption, 65% will come from China. These are the objectives of the Critical Materials Act that are called as too ambitious by many from inside the industry, just to give you an idea of what we're looking at here. Moving further downstream the value chain, of course, China dominates as well in terms of the, starting from the rare earth magnets all the way to electric vehicles and other green and high technology products. But I think we should take a long, hard look at the structural drivers of this dominance to get away from our tendency to imagine that the sole reason for this is, as I said, the low regulatory environment and low labor and environmental environment. So I've said a bit about China's vulnerabilities, China's dominance. Let me say just 2 words about China's vulnerabilities, because I think that we have to think about the other side of the ledger if we are to develop some interesting responses to that. China's dominance in the midstream segment is paired with China's import reliance for most of its raw minerals needs. This is something that is not repeated enough here, but China is more than 50% import reliant for 20 out of 40 or so non-fuel critical minerals. In this sense, the coverage on rare earths and the fact that China has chosen rare earths as a sort of tool of economic coercion is more the exception than the rule. The structure of China's import dependence on most of critical minerals does not resemble the rare earths situation at all. In fact, if you look at the export controls that China has imposed over the years, on germanium or gallium or others, such niche minerals, they are cases where China holds dominance in domestic production and refining. China has not imposed export controls on nickel or copper, right? This is upstream. Even downstream, the value chain, China also is exposed. And here it's exposed differently, and this is a space that is evolving in very interesting ways. China is dependent on export access for its finished manufactured products, which do include the rare earths magnets, etc. And here it is a very quickly evolving space where China is encountering pushback in not only in the US, right, around the world, from Brazil and Turkey to India and the West. And so I'm almost done here. Just one word. When we speak about right-sizing the challenge, of course, I think it's important that we right-size China's strengths and vulnerabilities. But as Vina indicated, we have some work to do in right-sizing the US challenge right now, too, in this space. And what I mean by that is that the Canadian critical mineral strategy was written in 2022 under a Biden administration. And I think we haven't yet done the homework in adjusting how we should adjust our, strategic play, given what the current US administration is doing. We could speak about the regulatory environment, which will have a very strong, attractive effect on capital in the US, which may have second-order negative effects for the investment environment here. But at the same time, the US administration is also reversing on broader climate change targets. It does not have a very strong integrated industrial strategy vision, the same way as the Biden administration had. The uncertainty is very high. The reliance on tariffs and reluctance to engage multilaterally, all of this actually pulls in the other direction, so weakens US, in my view, US resilience and attractiveness. And so we have sort of in both directions shifting structural incentives that Canada should perhaps work very hard to understand, in terms of positioning here. And so that we can position ourselves better. But I will leave my opening remarks here and look forward to saying more later.
Thank you so much, Pascal. I know it's difficult for a professor to speak in 10 minutes and try to get as much on the table as you did, so we very much appreciate that. And I know there are a number of themes that you touched on that I hope we can go deeper in the discussion. But we have sort of a taste of both understanding the China dominance so that we set realistic targets, and mentioning the EU example I think is really quite telling in terms of what even a most ambitious set of targets are actually like, as well as understanding the vulnerabilities. I think there's a lot there that we can explore in terms of what China is choosing to do right now in its sort of tension or game of leverage with the US since April of this year, sort of which particular elements it's targeting and why. And I think your point in terms of its own dependence on imports is a really interesting one there to explore. And then, of course, what does this all mean for Canada? We'll get to that in a lot more detail. But I want to bring in Constantine to kind of reflect on all of this from an industry perspective. You have been in this game as a CEO of Neo Performance Materials, which was one of the only sort of non-Chinese companies that was actually competitive in this field. Graphite, I believe, right? Germanium, sorry. Well,
no, rare earths.
Rare earth, gallium in particular, which is very much in the headlines now. So I'd like you to reflect both on sort of what the landscape here in Canada has looked like, both in engagement with China, but also now, specifically in the current context, how industry has seen the strategy, notwithstanding the fact that it only has $4 billion attached to it, kind of what's the landscape like now, and anything else that you want to kind of bring in with concrete examples from the industry's perspective. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vina, and thank you for the invitation. It's a wonderful initiative. I think we're way overdue in the country to have a critical minerals hub think tank, because we really need to think about this, and I don't think enough thinking, no offense to folks in the room, but we haven't done enough thinking about the subject, critical minerals being as critical as they are and so on, but I think this is really close to what we do, what we can do in this country, and we should be doing a lot better. So, wonderful book by Pascal, and I'll plagiarize shamelessly in my comments. And I guess I want to apologize ahead of time if my curmudgeonly cynicism takes the better of me and I become less diplomatic than I should be. So a couple of things about my background. I'm a chemical engineer from the University of Toronto. Don't hold that against me, given the number of UBC folks in the room. And I started my career working in the oil business. I started working for Imperial Oil. I always wanted to be an oil man, and once I was in the oil business, I realized that that's not what I wanted to do. I joined Linde, the industrial gases business, which became Praxair, and then in 1993, I was working with a friend in Toronto, lawyer, investment banker, and we started Neo Performance Materials, or what is today Neo Performance Materials. I went through business development, sales, chairman of the Chinese joint ventures, chief operating officer, and then CEO. Chairman, after I retired from CEO, then back to CEO, then I retired again, and then back to CEO. And this is my final retirement, third time lucky, I guess. So I have, over the last 30, 35 years, had a front row seat in China's development, whether I liked it or not. we were the first company that was allowed, the first foreign company that was allowed to invest in China's rare earth industry. And just to understand the regulatory environment in China, the resource sector in the rare earth industry, as well as other critical minerals, is not open to foreign investment. And for years, I've been advocating reciprocity, which some of our friends in the various ministries did not want to go down that road. But I have been observing the unfolding of regulation and also the development of China's supply chains relating to my industry. The whole game in China started in the late 80s when they discovered significant content of rare earth elements in the tailings of the largest iron ore processing facility in China, in Baotou, by Baotou Iron and Steel. The iron ore mine is about 100 kilometers north in Bayanobo. The concentrate, the ore comes into Baotou, the iron ore is processed, the iron is separated, and in the tailings, that's one of the richest deposits of rare earths in the world. So the Chinese started with a fundamental advantage here, which is zero mining costs, because that deposit was essentially paid for by the iron ore processing. It's got all kinds of other issues associated with it, but economically, they did start with a massive advantage. Then the development of the industry has benefited from decades of attention by the central government, as well as provincial governments and local governments, with extremely heavy investment in R&D and skills development, which is something that has not happened outside of China. So that's sort of the background. We bought controlling interest in 2 Chinese rare earth refineries, which we then grew, modernized, and focused on exports. And so needless to say that from 1994 to 2023, when I retired, I still do, I spent a lot of time dealing with regulators in the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, as well as almost an equal amount of time with the trade section at the Canadian Embassy, which, if anybody is interested in doing any business in China, your first call should be to the embassy, because the quality of expertise and smarts at the embassy is extraordinary. So keep that in the back of you. But that's the first advice I give to anybody. First off, when you go to Beijing, go to the embassy and speak with the trade folks, because you will need them invariably. So to add a little bit of color on what we're going through right now, given tariffs, given the narrative that talks about the weaponization of rare earths, let me sort of remind the room of a couple of comments by Henry Kissinger, who some people like, some people loathe, some people do both. I'm on the latter camp, but you can't neglect the intellectual firepower that Henry Kissinger brought to the table. And there's 2 things two comments that I've been using. One is states do not have friends, they have interests. So I think it behooves countries like Canada to focus on the Canadian interest. Second, he made a comment at the end of the Vietnam War that being an enemy of the United States is very dangerous. Being a friend of the United States is lethal. So before we get on with complaining about the way we're being treated, being the best friend of the United States and so on, we're in a new world. Realpolitik rules the day, and we need to get on with what we need to do in our country for the interest of our own citizens. So how does this get us to critical minerals? Okay, well, diversification being, diversification of trade being, I guess, a commonly expressed strategy for Canada. I think we need to continue growing our economy with not neglecting the United States, because, I mean, we're prisoners of geography, right? However, as a former public company CEO and chair, this is an example that I like to bring up. Whenever we issued quarterly or annual results in the management discussion and analysis section in the MD&A, we had to analyze all the risks or the potential risks affecting our business. And if we had a single customer responsible for more than 10% of our revenues, that was a risk. By regulation, we had to disclose it, and we had to talk about how we are going to deal with it. So if a public company sets, or if regulation set the threshold for customer concentration at 10%, what is that level for a country's trade dependence to a single geography? I'm sure it's not 80%, it's not 75%. I don't know what it is. This is way above my pay grade to determine, but I think we really need to have been working on this a long time ago. We're a trading nation, and we can only function properly as part of a multilateral environment. We can't do it on our own. We're way too small. As much as we'd like to think that we're important, our firepower, our economic and intellectual firepower will only take us so far. So I think it's really critical to continue to work on repairing the relationships that we have done serious damage to over the last few years. And I'm speaking specifically about China and India. We need to do better. And we can talk about this later or outside the room. So back to critical minerals. The problem, and this is where I'll plagiarize Pascal, as she said, the West has been asleep at the wheel, at the switch. Sorry, both, yeah. So when you fall asleep at the wheel, crashes are inevitable. At the same time, the industry has a history where every 10 to 15 years there's a crisis. So the narrative explodes about the weaponization of A, B, and C. We need to do things differently. Prices spike, they go through the roof, and then, of course, when things settle down, prices come back to something much more normal. Availability is restored, and then we forget about it and go on with other more important issues. I remember conversations in DC in 2010, during the previous crisis, when China was thinking of restricting the exports of the more obscure rare earths. Japan was the following year because of the Senkaku Island incident, which that's when they first said, but that is something, again, the context is very different depending on whose analysis you follow. The truth is that rare earths stopped flowing to Japan, prices went through the roof, and then, of course, 7 weeks later, that's how long that embargo lasted, because I know I had a container of stuff going to Japan at the port of Shanghai, and my customers were panicking. But the embargo was restored. And since we talked about real examples, the reason I believe, and I'm a bit of an outlier on this, I believe that the reason the embargo was canceled was because the rare earths were going from China to Japan. They were made into devices that were indispensable for the production of electronics, especially smartphones. One of my customers in Japan is still the largest producer of these tiny chips, not smart chips, but they control the flow of signals in printed circuit boards. And there's about 700 to 800 in every smart device. So once those chips started flowing back to China to be assembled into phones, and 100,000 people were out on the street because the factories were closing, that's when the embargo was lifted. So this is an example of globalization being a force for eventually people coming to their senses. So Now, back to what we have and what we could be doing. First of all, again, on Pascal's comment about being asleep at the switch for a very long time, I estimate about 3 decades. We have neglected our industrial strategy, which was indispensable, taking the American and the Canadian economy and the European economies to where they are today, post-Second World War. The fact that we abandoned industrial strategies and we left it to capital markets, in other words, people like me. And here's where I can make it personal, and I can relate to decisions made on a day-to-day basis. We left it on people like me whose job depends on our share price. And our share price depends on our return on capital. We compete in the rare earth sector, which is a very small, by global commodity markets, it's tiny. However, its effect is disproportionate downstream of where our industry is. We depend on companies like NEO and MP Materials and Linus and so on, and all of us live and die by our share price. Every quarter we have to face our shareholders and explain how things moved and what happened. And we compete against companies in China who have access to unlimited capital at a very, very low cost of capital. My cost of capital as a Canadian public company, let's say, is in the teens, low teens, high single digits. So for every investment I make, I need to earn another 3, 4, 5 points on top of that. And I'm competing against Chinese magnet companies who either need to only break even or earn 2 or 3 points, and then they will eat my lunch day in, day out. I can't compete with that. So to bring that home, the last thing I did before retiring in July 2023 is I broke ground on a new rare earth magnet facility in Estonia. Estonia, because we already had a rare earth refinery, one of the 2 in Europe, and the largest one in Europe. And the synergies were very obvious. So we broke ground on a plant that we ended up, NEO, after my retirement, ended up spending about $75 million. And we have the official opening in 2 weeks, so I'll be in Narva. As Estonia says, this is where Europe starts, because we're 3 kilometers away from the Narva River, which is the border with Russia. This plant was built in 15 months. The first commercial shipment was made 18 months from the start of earthworks. And it's now the largest rare earth magnet producer in Europe. Now, how did we get there? I remember I was summoned to Stuttgart by one of the large German automakers, basically saying, we make more money in China than anywhere else, but we don't want to be completely dependent on China for all the things that we do here in Germany. And this is also around the time when Europe was trying to figure out their critical raw material strategy, because they sense that in the energy transition, as we move from internal combustion engines to EVs, unless Europe localized production of the key components, being batteries and drivetrains, these are the 2 highest cost components in every EV, unless they did that and instead imported drivetrains and batteries from Korea, Japan, China, this would have cost them hundreds of thousands of jobs, which in an industry that's the backbone of the German and the European economy. So they tried back then. So we were able to understand demand because we had the support of German customers. However, I made it clear to them that unless they were willing to pay a premium over the Chinese price, it was impossible for any company, not just my company, but any company, to compete against producers in China. They agreed to pay a modest premium, but eventually what made the difference that allowed me to convince my board to put up $75 million was the fact that the Just Transition Fund in Europe, which predated the European Raw Materials Act, which was investing in countries around Europe to allow them to decarbonize their economies and transition into new economies. We were able to get a 20% capital grant, so 20%, $15 million out of the total capex came from the European Union. This is what made the difference in our internal rate of return calculation that allowed us to say, okay, now we can go ahead. So in most cases, it's not necessary to provide massive support. What you need to do, though, is provide the necessary support to make sure that your capex, your return on capital, and your operating costs are competitive. Because if they're not, you're not going to survive very long. So again, demand drives supply chains. For those of you that read Porter's book on the competitive advantage of nations, I don't need to repeat it. I talk about it at all conferences that I speak, but demand is absolutely necessary. And here's the paradox that we have, another paradox in North America. The Trump administration is providing massive funding to reestablish rare earth supply chains in the United States. If you followed the sector, the recent deal with MP Materials, the CapEx grants from the Department of Defense to MP and Lynas to build heavy rare earth refining in the United States. However, the demand, where is the demand? The defense industry, even though it dominates the narrative, the demand is tiny compared to the rest of the industry. Automotive, in my experience, is sort of 2/3 of global demand for rare earths, and that goes up by an order of magnitude when you're talking about EVs. And I could go on and give you specific examples to a painful degree. So on one hand, the United States is trying to bring rare earth production and midstream refining and magnet production to the United States. But on the other hand, the EV industry in North America is being decimated. So demand for rare earths is being destroyed while production is being encouraged and heavily subsidized. Europe, I think it's still maintaining its senses around the energy transition, and EVs are still a priority of Europe. The last comment I'm going to make about China is they have been, China, not to quote Kissinger ad infinitum, but in the interest of China, they developed an industrial strategy. And what they have been doing is executing on that strategy, because that's in the interest, as far as they're concerned, that's in the interest of the country and its citizens. And they've been executing a strategy that is rational, and it's smart. And I could talk about my meetings with regulators. It's people who learn from their mistakes, don't repeat the mistakes again, and they're fantastic students of history. They know what mercantilism has done and how economies have built around the world during the Industrial Revolution and the mid-war years. So they've learned a lot of lessons from what the West has done and how resource nationalism became a very necessary thing to do for the West in the 50s and the 60s. Right now, Chinese companies are investing in lithium assets. In fact, I sold an asset to a Chinese mining company 2 years ago, in rare earth assets, and all kinds of other critical minerals around the world. The response has been rather meek in the West. As far as the Canadian critical mineral strategy goes, I was at a conference just about a year ago when the senior VP in charge of purchasing for a major automaker was asked about the Canadian critical mineral strategy, and she laughed, and the answer was, well, what strategy? Not my words, her words, so don't come after me. I think we need to be a little bit more realistic. I think the things that Canada could be doing and the West could be doing collectively, I think we need to be thinking in terms of Why do we need rare earths and critical minerals? I mean, they are indispensable if we're going to continue to drive our industrial economy. So how do we go about it? In Canada, we have deposits. Some good, some not so good. I see David there who has one of the better ones in the country. However, we don't have the kinds of deposits that would set the world on fire, that are game changers like Mountain Pass in California or Mount Weld in Australia. However, with a bit of help, these deposits can become competitive. Second, the problem that the industry has in Canada is it doesn't have customers. So Defense Metals could produce mining concentrate, but where's that going to go? There's no refining in the country. There's no magnet production. The only place it could go is either China or in the United States when those refineries are built. Same thing with lithium. We have given, and I'm only quoting the Globe and Mail, so don't hold that against me. We're on the hook as Canadian taxpayers for $55 billion of subsidies to the electric vehicle industry over the next 15 years. Has anybody heard whether any of that $55 billion is conditional on those EVs being built with Canadian critical minerals content? I missed it if that was the case. I mean, if we're giving companies, you know, a fairly substantial taxpayers' largesse to build batteries and EV drivetrains and EVs in this country, can we not even create the moral obligation to source the critical minerals from local supply chains? If that doesn't work, perhaps, you know, we can look at concentrations of lithium and rare earth deposits around the country, and maybe then we can subsidize the creation of demand. Lithium, I'm pretty close to. All the lithium developments in the country, perhaps with the exception of a Quebec operation, their only customers for the output of the mines are Chinese converters. So we can build all the lithium mines in the country, but they will have to ship their output to Qinghai or Shanghai or where all the converters are. So why don't we create a world-class lithium refinery in this country, which could then provide offtakes to the miners, so the miners can finance themselves? Because especially since Chinese investment in Canadian critical mineral companies was outlawed, these junior miners have not been able to keep the lights on. It's become incredibly difficult to get the markets to raise equity or even provide any debt for them. So I think we need to rethink our strategy around foreign investment, and specifically Chinese investment in critical minerals, within a set of rules that serve the national interest, of course. So I think the answer is we need to come up with an industrial strategy that's rational, and it focuses on demand. It needs to be, perhaps we need to learn from the Japanese strategy, who financed Lynas into production on the basis that 100% of their phase one production in Malaysia and the Malaysia refinery would go to Japan. We need to learn from what Europe is doing, and perhaps now Brazil is rewriting the book on industrial strategy with $1 billion, half from private sources, half from government, looking to not only help Brazilian resource companies get into production, but also establish the midstream, the refining and magnet production. And you know, I have the luxury of advising BNDES, the Brazilian National Development Bank, on this strategy. And I think I've been very impressed with the kind of rational thinking that goes into it. So it's not mystery. There's no magic bullets. It will have to be a long-term approach. It has to be based on an industrial strategy, and that industrial strategy need to focus on demand creation. Because if that doesn't get created, the batteries or the battery manufacturing that we're subsidizing in this country will have to source all its lithium from China or Chile or Argentina or wherever else lithium is being produced, and the same thing will go for the drivetrains. Unless we can produce these value-added materials, we'll continue to be hewers of wood and drawers of water and letting other folks do the value-added. Finally, one last thing. There's a serious blind spot, and that's education. We don't have the skills in North America. I made this comment and I showed a chart from the OECD showing how many STEM and especially engineering grads China produces versus the countries in the West. We're talking orders of magnitude difference. In China, I can hire undergrads and graduate school graduates with degrees in rare earth engineering, rare earth chemistry, rare earth metallurgy. I can't find those people anywhere else. Everywhere else, I have to hire the smartest people I can get my hands on, send them to my labs to be trained for 3 years before I let them touch anything. In China, I can hire them out of school, and I throw them in my plants, and they're immediately productive. So the build-out of the midstream is contingent on skills development. There are a couple of outfits in the country that are doing a pretty decent job. The Saskatchewan Research Council is creating a hub and trying to develop its critical mass. There's a number of universities around the country. A good friend of mine is here at UBC. Well, not here, but UBC. Excellent hydromet skills, but we need to focus some smart minds on how this game is played and how the country can benefit out of, I can't say enough about the smarts and the brilliance of the Canadian educational establishment. However, that needs to be channeled somehow and incentivized to spend time and effort and develop the key skills that are needed in critical minerals. I won't tire you anymore. I'll hand it back to Vina.
Thank you so much, Constantine. I think you anticipated many of the questions that I had, and certainly I wanted the room to also present. You're clearly used to doing keynotes, so that really felt more like a really well thought out keynote on both kind of the challenges, real examples, and also the solutions. I think we want to hear obviously more in today's conversation, but also in the further work that we'll do on things that have worked both here in Canada. The example you gave on building something in Estonia in 15 months, I think is exactly the kinds of things that we need to be showcasing more of, especially the kind of the targeted intervention and policies of governments. So it doesn't have to be on big scale. I notice those wordings. It doesn't have to be huge amounts of money, but it has to be well thought out policies that kind of support you both with capital, but also reducing risk, creating demand, most importantly. So I think there's a lot. And then, of course, learning from examples you mentioned from Japan. We're very keen to learn Japan, Brazil, and others. So there will be a lot more coming out, if not in this conversation, then in subsequent work that we'll do showcasing those things. The point on education, I think, is well taken, and I know folks around the room would want to reflect on that, and obviously partnering with universities, and I'm sure, Pascal, you would want to come in on that. One quick question that I had on demand, and before I turn to Pascal, is, and I'm sure it's top of mind for many, and certainly the US has made this a key issue, is that not just EVs, but the defense industrial sector, basically all the sort of defense needs. But if you could just quickly highlight sort of what are other sectors that create demand in addition to the auto sector and EVs?
Well, the auto sector is a big user.
Yeah.
However, outside of auto sector, I mean, when I try to think back at market segmentation in my business, household goods, one of my biggest customers was Dyson. So next time you're using a Dyson vacuum cleaner, that motor spins 4 times faster than a jet engine. Keep that in mind. And then there's one of the magnets that we made for them. Same thing with their hair dryers. Not that I need one, but I have one for my wife and my 3 sons. Consumer goods, electronics, it's indispensable. Next time your smartphone vibrates, there's a little tiny magnet in that vibration motor. The chips that I mentioned, electronics, typically, I don't ever recall any sales to the defense establishment. However, my sales always broke down about 80% auto, 20% electronics and household goods. And keep in mind that if we believe in the energy transition, the rare earths become indispensable on both sides of that equation. Both energy production, wind turbines, especially offshore ones, big, like tons of rare earth magnets in each turbine. And on the consumption, energy consumption side, rare earth magnet motors consume a fraction of the electricity, of the electrical power that a non-rare earth magnet motor consumes. That's why they're used in EVs. You can build an electric motor without rare earth magnets, but you have to compete against someone who makes a similar motor with rare earth magnets and consumes 30% less energy, which means your battery has 30% more range. So, yeah, electronics, household goods, there's a few other, rather esoteric applications, but even any of these applications is orders of magnitude, at least one order of magnitude greater than what collectively North American defense requirements are.
Understood. Thank you so much. Pascal, I want to turn to you before opening up to the room on a few things around what Canada should do, sort of building on the practical examples Constantine made, but maybe more sort of big picture policy recommendation, given the current moment we're in, that the government is developing a overall industrial strategy. We're talking about sort of foreign policy review strategies, Indo-Pacific strategy. Everything is under review and being sort of looked at. What are some things that you would suggest that we do on this issue?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Constantine. Those were absolutely fantastic thoughts. This is why I think we need to bring more people from within the industry to weigh in on those issues. So grateful. What I want to do here, just for the next few minutes, I'll try to answer your question, Vina, but I feel like I really don't have all the answers. I have more questions than answers, and I'd like to ask them in a way, weaving in some insights, but also sort of asking us collectively to think about things a bit differently. And I group them in 3 categories. And the first set of questions that I've been thinking about is about Canada's unique positioning. And really the question is that I think we should ask and try to answer is, what or who is Canada's critical minerals strategy for? And the unique reality of Canada, which is in a unique position compared to pretty much any other developed economy, perhaps except Australia and the US, is that we both have to think of ourselves as a resource power, but also try to think of our own economic security, industrial policy for our own sort of economic growth needs. And those are not necessarily, I don't think they necessarily align all the time. And, if I am thinking about Canada's, industrial policy, keeping in mind our comparative advantage situation and also the fact that we can shape the economy going forward, but we don't start from a sort of blank page. I would say 2 things here. I noticed, in our critical mineral strategy, we've identified 6 priority minerals. In our other documents, we tried to do this, but really I was looking at this, this is lithium, cobalt, graphite, copper, nickel, rare earths. This level of granularity is wholly insufficient, right? Constantine has already given us much food for thought in how to think about industrial ecosystems, and thinking of the Chinese experience, using the proximity of our existing industrial ecosystems in the aerospace industry or in the automotive industry to sort of be able to build around and through this. Graphite, yes, but tell us about, frictionless electrical motors, or, let's be a bit more specific here. The other Canadian specificity that I would mention is that because we are an existing resource power, many of the critical minerals that we are talking about, so there are different categories of stuff, right? As I say again and again, copper is not the same as germanium. We cannot put them in the same, we cannot think about them in the same ways. Many of those critical minerals are byproducts other things. And in Canada, we already have existing mining operations. Like, for example, the US is starting importing much of its germanium needs from here in BC because it's a byproduct of zinc refining. Gallium, I've been hearing that Rio has started extracting gallium from its Quebec aluminium operations. And so I don't find that this is often in the space, right? We can't justify opening mines just for certain critical minerals. They come together with other things. The other category or set of questions that I think we should ask ourselves, and that I am asking myself at the very least, is that Canada is a resource power, but we're also a medium-sized economy. So we can be part of solutions, but we cannot be the solution on our own. And so how effective we are depends on how we forge partnerships with others. And we must think about critical mineral security and take a leaf here from the global value chain literature, in a networked fashion. And I think that we've had too much of the habit of thinking about this at the border. And of course, the US president is not helping with his focus on tariffs and borders, which is sort of antithetical to the status of global supply and value chains. So we have basically a coordination problem. A lot of the solutions that we are hearing, whether it's on the stockpiling, whether it's on price floors, all of these cannot be created just in Canada. They have to be created in coordination with others. It's really difficult, especially as we are in a moment of global fragmentation and where multilateral institutions are basically fragmenting instead of becoming stronger. So, I've been reading the various documents that our Prime Minister, along with partners, have been signing. The most recent one is the Canada-Germany joint declaration. And here again, we have a few, some of the language in there is interesting. There's a few priority minerals in there. There's gallium, germanium, tungsten makes it to the list. Priority areas of activity, some, as I said, and Constantine is right, there's some good people in government working on this. So, we see language on mineral processing and recycling. We see supply chain integration language, best practices on traceability. It's constructive. But the declaration, of course, is not legally binding. There's no financial commitments that have been earmarked. And not to bring Ezra Klein's abundance debate in this room, which would take us in a different direction. But, China's not sitting around, and I quote from the declaration here, establishing task forces on critical minerals cooperation to follow up on progress of implementation in the areas of cooperation. I could go on, right? So we are here facing a question of speed and scale that I think has been left out of the discussion. And the last point I'll make on partnerships is that the current Canadian government has been doing great work on reinforcing partnerships with traditional partners, which I understand is important in our current context. But I would just say that Asia has been left out of the discussion to date. So we haven't seen from our current government nearly a sufficient effort to sort of engage the Indo-Pacific. And so I hope that here, with this initiative, we can, spearhead some of this work. We need to remind the government to be more present and also to listen to our Indo-Pacific partners' needs and how we can align. Again, most of what Canada can do has to be done in coordination with others. The last question or set of questions that I've been thinking about is what should our end game goals look like? So what are we actually trying to achieve here? And I could take this, just that question could take us, into a discussion of many hours. But, we know, for instance, that onshoring is not necessarily a recipe for resilience. Right, so the goal here is not to fully onshore upstream extraction. The question really is, how do we think about different end goals depending on the different contexts? And I think this is something that I'll be working on. So how do we think about different minerals, different end uses? We've been talking about defense and how small that market is. how do we think about those various contexts and develop some resilience goals that are acceptable for those different contexts? The European strategy is interesting because it puts numbers on goals, but it makes no sense to have a 65% goal that applies to tungsten, copper, nickel, and uranium. It makes no sense. These are not the same markets, they're not the same security contexts, and so we should be much more, doing work into advancing those, the level of granularity here. And here, the way I think about it, and I've developed a framework in a piece I recently published in The Diplomat called Asymmetric Resilience, is that we should look to recalibrate dependencies, but we cannot hope to eliminate them, given everything that we've said today. And so we have to work on recalibration, find positions of comfort. Where is our position of comfort? What does resilience look like for Canada in terms of copper refining? Are we comfortable with 40% of the global copper being refined in China? Maybe we are. We have to ask those questions. What are we trying to achieve here? And then I think we should also be the discussion has been very defensive. I think we should develop some sort of more assertive points here. And since I've been talking about partnerships, and China's import vulnerabilities, we should be all over third countries. We should be all over Latin America and Chile or Peru. So in other words, China needs these relationships to continue to work well. We have very good relationships with some of these same partners. We should be thinking about this in perhaps a little bit more forward-leaning ways than we have. And the last point I'll make here is that, of course, we're having a discussion about resilience and pursuing, national security or securitization goals is valid. We have some recalibration work to do. That's fine. Thinking about an end game and an end game at the global level, I think we should ask ourselves questions about the degree to which we want this weaponization of resources to continue going forward. So there is also value in reminding ourselves that continued escalation and weaponization will also be detrimental to our own security and resilience goals in the end. Not every mineral, not every supply chain needs to be weaponized or should be. And here, we should keep in mind that the interconnectedness of those global critical mineral supply chains is both a structural feature and also an important component of resilience in and of itself. And so I would just ask us to reflect on the degree to which, this pursuit of resilience and security should be paired with the creation of credible reassurances, guardrails, as it were, regarding a commitment to stability, transparency, and continued open access for many of the metals and minerals that we depend on. And this is also lacking from the discussion, and this is something that I feel that we could eventually even engage China on. So I will leave you with these thoughts. And
thank you so much, Pascal. And all of those questions that you put on the table are obviously the questions that we want to grapple with as part of this hub and this initiative with you and other colleagues around the table. And I think the point on Asia, we would definitely obviously underscore that while the engagement in the last few months has been very much with Europe, that we do need to look at our partners in the Indo-Pacific. So, and I think this fall will offer some opportunities with Prime Minister Carney traveling to the region. So I think discussions like these are also timely to focus the mind on what is to come in the next few months. You guys have all been extremely patient, so I'd like to now open the floor for any comments, questions, reflections, suggestions you may have for us as we try to do this work in a more kind of organized way through this hub. You can put your name tags. I'll try to collect as many of those questions and reflections as possible. So yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for your thoughts and comments. It was a really great learning experience, especially as a student. Yes, so what I do is I studied Korea's cobalt and critical mineral industries for my master's thesis, and the Asia point and who is Canada's critical minerals strategy for came to mind because it's minilaterals now. It's kind of having like-minded partners in smaller groupings that we really need to focus on. However, one of the criticisms I found for my thesis, especially concerning Canada and Korea's relationship, as they have MOUs to kind of bypass China in a certain way and build out South Korea's midstream refining practices. The issue with that was the cost aspect of it and the feasibility of having Canada as a partner compared to Chinese critical minerals that are much more accessible and don't have to travel as far, especially if we're considering the environmental aspects of it. And my second question is about the Canadian political system, and can we afford to handle like a prioritization of a single issue, which is critical minerals, because we are used to putting out fires rather than having like a singular vision for the future. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Rosetta. Others, don't be shy. I know it's tough to be first. I know there's a lot of expertise in the room, so please don't be. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Lini Zheng, and I'm visiting professor of UBC. And because my major is international law, I like to ask questions from the perspective of international, especially international environmental law and also international economic law, professor. Because your major is about the political economy, and I have read your book. Yeah, a very good book. Yeah, And my question is that, what do you think is the right or the concrete international forum or international agreement between Canada and China to strengthen the mutual understanding and commitment to in critical minerals? And because the multinational trade system, we all know that WTO, the crisis of WTO and especially the disputes. And do you think how to strengthen the mutual commitment and the mutual interest between Canada and China? Because I come from China. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Others?
Hi. Hi, my name is Juliette Liu. I'm at the University of British Columbia's Policy School. And I had a question for both that I'll be really quick. So I was wondering from Constantine, the point, maybe can you explain this point of reciprocity? I'm interested in if you have a hunch as to what are the barriers for the Canadian government in actually kind of asserting that in the negotiations? And for Professor Massot, I was interested in, do you see the suggestion of a networked fashion of resource security? Is that somewhere in between the open market and the security angle, or is it something different? And do you think the open market path to resource security is viable for some actors but not others, or just no longer viable in this current political moment? Thank you.
Thanks. David, I know Constantine mentioned you a couple of times. I don't know if you want to reflect on anything, putting you on the spot.
I've been with Defence now for about a month, so Constantine probably knows more about this company than I actually know. But I previously, most of my career I've been working with companies engaging in China. I spent 5 years with a battery manufacturer based out of China. We built a mine in Mongolia, heavily built by Chinese. So a lot of the points that Constantine raised there, access to capital, the infrastructure that's available to you, the skill sets that are available to you in China, I mean, they really ring home as they resonate. That is what I saw in China, for sure. What I was particularly interested in is access to capital, is early stage capital. And that's one area that we mentioned, the junior market. I was working with a copper company here for the last couple of years, and then I've moved into discovery. The investor market for exploration for early stage projects is pretty dismal in terms of trying to find the money to do it. And then even as you move through that chain, we have a project that's at pre-feasibility stage, reserves, which is a pretty rare and unusual circumstance for an REE company. Now you need to find $40-50 million to move to the feasibility, and then you take the next step. And this is a difficult period because although I've been involved already with a lot of really positive government engagements, there seems to be a restriction, a push to look for those projects that are a little bit further down the strata at feasibility. And in reality, for the REE projects, if you don't have reserves, you're not financing, so you're pretty early stage. So ideas about being able to access government funding on an equity side where you can get projects to that next level, beyond grassroots, but moving to construction.
That would be great. Thanks so much. Maybe, San, I'll take your question, then I'll turn to Constantine. Yeah.
Thank you, Constantine. My apologies. And Pascal, thank you for your wonderful insight. So from Constantine, I'm hearing that government has to spark demands in critical mineral industries, which is kind of similar argument. I made the similar argument in my dissertation about green transition. So my question is that, are you suggesting that government should seriously consider East Asian style industrial policy for critical minerals, which is equipped with massive government subsidies, government-led investment, and public finances, etc.? Or do you have your own ideas on industrial policy that works best for Canada? Because Canada has very different contexts from East Asian countries. For example, like EV manufacturing facilities and rare earth elements refining facilities are lagging in Canada, as far as I know. Well, if we go back to the US, by the way, when the Sino-Japanese territorial disputes and the rare earth elements embargo happened, the US very much wanted to reestablish the rare earth element facilities in their own territory, but failed because of high cost and lack of visibility of doing that in their own territory. But with those high cost and high uncertainty, it would be impossible for the corporate sector, like business and companies, to make a brave decision to reestablish rare earth elements refining facilities or something else. So my question is that again, when and how does the government jump in? And that's for Constantine. And the second question is about securitization of critical minerals, which can be answered by Constantine and Pascal as well. Given China's sheer monopoly of the resource, rare earth elements, and its continuous threat to weaponize the resource in geopolitically challenging situations, let me direct your attention to securitization dimension of this issue. One of my previous papers analyzed the rare earth embargo in the Sino-Japan territorial dispute, and my co-author and I found that China's interdependence on Japan for its market access was one of the reasons that the embargo didn't last that long. Well, seven weeks was pretty long, but it wasn't that long as we expected, which is similar, which is exactly the same of Europe's observation. So, yeah. Right. Sure, yeah. But as far as I know, ever since then, Japan has relatively and successfully diversified its rare earth elements trading partners, including Australia and Brazil. So I believe it gives a huge implication to South Korea, a resource-insufficient country, but Canada, again, is different from Korea because it has a deposit, right? But like I said, it lacks a refining facility. So what do you think Ottawa's desirable and ideal goal to address the potential securitization of rare earth elements and other critical minerals? Because this is my personal perspective that the securitization issue will happen again sooner or later. So let me stop here, and thank you for your patience.
Great, thank you so much. So great questions. Maybe Constantine, I'll start with you on the questions around capital, industrial strategy, industrial policy, securitization, and any of the other points that you want to weigh in on.
I'm at a bit of a disadvantage here because my understanding of securitization is a little different.
That's
Talks
all
about
right.
turning things into tradable securities.
Yes,
and
that's
that got us into trouble a few years ago. But
is
in
important
terms of
to-
national security, by the way, I have to say that I really don't like the word weaponization.
Sure.
I think it's a very relative word. It helps create impressions, and it's the established narrative. I get it. I mean, the New York Times will say Xi Jinping visited a magnet factory in Jiangxi province. He's ready to weaponize rare earths again and so on. But I guess this is the world we live in. I wouldn't go that far to call it weaponization, but be that as it may. When it comes to Canada vis-a-vis Korea and Japan, outside of China, they're the two largest consumers of rare earths in Asia because they have industries that need rare earths. I remember a massive success I had when I set up our first sales office in Seoul in 1995, and by 1997 we had 80% market share in Korea. 3 years later, that market was a lot smaller because Samsung, LG, and to a lesser degree Korea Zinc moved their manufacturing facilities to China, but they became customers of ours in China. So Korea still needs rare earths. At the end of the day, with the right cost structure, you know, the way the industry works, you can compete. As long as that cost structure is correct. So I don't see any issues with Korean customers or Japanese customers taking rare, buying rare earths that are produced in Canada, because what Japan has done, they invested about $250 million during Linus's formative stages to help with the mine construction in Australia and the refinery in Malaysia. And they got 100% of phase one offtake for Japan. So that was part of something that was thought through. And let's face it, and the CEO of Linus is a friend of mine. Amanda Lacaze, the CEO, does not disagree when I say without the Japanese support, Linus would have gone bankrupt a long time ago. We've seen a lot of bankruptcies in the West. Molycorp bought my company in 2012 for $1.3 billion, and it filed for bankruptcy in 2015. If you remember, and to your question about the WTO, this was, I don't know if you remember the Obama administration filing a complaint with the WTO on China's export controls. The WTO decision came in, fighting against China. China respected it, removed the export controls, prices collapsed to the point where Molycorp couldn't stay in business, so they filed for bankruptcy. So some of these things cut both ways. So in terms of an international trading environment, I am so lost. So I don't know what to say because the international trading system that some of us, the older ones in the room, grew up with, is being demolished. So unless multilateralism steps back in and there's a semblance of a return to a rules-based international trading system, I don't know how we're going to deal with it.
Although it doesn't seem that that's the direction we're going in. It's actually the minimum prices is what we're now going in, guarantees of markets. And
yeah, you see, the world is responding to what the Trump administration is doing. So Australia is thinking of a minimum price. They're thinking about a strategic stockpile. But I neglected to mention Australia earlier. There's a lot of lessons to be learned from Australia, especially for a country like Canada, where we have a lot of similarities. Resource-based economies, a big neighbor, and for Australia, it's China and Japan. But let's look at Australia. Australia has put $1 billion into Iluka, and their Iluka is using the waste from their heavy mineral sands to recover rare earths and construct a refinery in Australia. Of course, it's not for the domestic market because there's no buyers of rare earths in Australia, so it's strictly for export into countries like Korea and Japan. So what I find remarkable in Australia is the part of the Five Eyes. They're building nuclear subs that, where else are they going to go if not the South China Sea? And yet, their iron ore goes to China, the wine goes to China, and increasingly their soybeans are going to China at the expense of Canadian farmers. And somehow they figure out how to have their cake and eat it too when it comes to China. Again, I don't know what it is, but I think there's lessons there to be learned. Again, it's way above my pay grade. In terms of the weaponization, I think at the end of the day, we need to return back to something that's a bit more rational and normal. I think a lot of the interpretation of the moves by China on critical minerals is done in the context of geopolitical contests. And, one of my favorite books has been Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And you do see a lot of signs that we're entering into a phase where irrational thinking is coming in and interpreting moves in critically dangerous ways. But I think if we don't return to a rules-based international trading order, I think we're at the mercy of knee-jerk decisions, governments picking winners, and making it much more difficult for everybody else to operate through the capital markets and getting financing and growth capital out of that. I'm not very optimistic unless we can return reasonably soon to some sort of rational rules-based order.
Pascal?
Thank you so much for all your questions. This is the range of the questions just really confirms to me how critical minerals is pulling from such very sort of bases of expertise, right? We're pulling from so many different fields. It's very, very rich, very difficult to answer all the questions at once, but I will try. I will just speak and see if I get to most of the questions. I found, so Constantine, your reaction to the sort of weaponization language and securitization language is very interesting to me. And while I do agree that reactions in the West to some of the things that others may do, China included, that may not have much to do with security, are being securitized, totally agree. At the same time, I think since April 4th and the export controls that were in the licensing system that was implemented on the Chinese side, we have entered a new era. And I would even go as far as to say that I think that within the Chinese system, the issue is being captured by other actors. And so we are not anymore in the sort of December 2023 MOFCOM controlled, era of
or the 2010 experience.
Exactly, even so. And so there is something unique happening in China. And to the question of my colleague here, Professor Chen, about international law, so first of all, I would just say about this new era that we're in, Paul Triolo had a great line on this, which is that now both the US and China have figured out the capacity to shut down factories on the other side. So in other words, this is sort of the mutually assured destruction scenario that we're in. And it was very obviously played out after April 4th around the world. The silver lining there, for me, is that it has jolted people to life on the Western side, and it has meant that in the short to midterm, we need to continue sort of interacting with China in a controlled way. So it in some ways, similarly to the sort of mad thesis in security, we have entered a space where the US and China have sort of leveled their strategic posture, and we are in a little bit of a limbo stage, but that has provided some sense of weirdly stability in this madness, On the international trading system, I was reading this morning a Financial Times article by Ngozi Iweala, the head of the WTO, who was reminding us that 75% of world trade is still conducted on MFN basis. So of course she will, she's the head of the WTO. We have to read into this, but just to say that, the rest of the world, despite the madness that is going on in the US, the rest of the world is still trading based on relatively predictable rules. And we have avoided to date the ceilingless escalation of the economic wars that some feared might happen following the early weeks of the Trump administration. However, definitely we are in a moment where those critical minerals have been securitized. And on this China question, how do we engage China here? I think that it is very important to continue having a dialogue with Chinese counterparts to make sure that there's no miscalculation and misinterpretation of the moves that will come. And so the lack of engagement and dialogue, I think, is detrimental to our own assessment of what our own security situation is. And so I would encourage some kind of dialogue to continue, and I hope that we can do some of that. Juliette Lou asked a tremendous question about a networked understanding of resource security or critical mineral supply chains or sort of resilience versus a fully securitized one and an fully open one. It's a great way to put it. My immediate reaction to this is twofold. The first point that I was trying to underscore is that we, as much as we would perhaps like to grasp for, early 20th century or mid 20th century models, our trading system has evolved and our global value and supply chains have evolved in such a complex way that have not been fully dismantled yet, that we are sort of applying, I think, certain impulses that are not taking into consideration the complex networked nature of our global production chains. And so it's just a sort of call to reality. The second part, though, is that I think that it's important to take into consideration how this varies across different minerals. Again, to remake the point, some minerals I really do believe need to remain based on more of an open market model. But there are different, and some may be less so. But always, and especially for an economy like Canada, it will be sort of networked. And thinking of the Australian example of stockpiling, their stockpiling initiative, 1.2 billion, sort of stockpiling effort. If every mid-sized country tried to launch a stockpiling initiative, can we just for a moment imagine how counterproductive this would be, right? So these questions need to be thought through in a plurilateral fashion. One last point I will make in response, Sun, to your comments about industrial policy. I think really industrial policy is a just fantastic and humongous topic that has not been unpacked at all in the West sufficiently. We are entering this new weird era where we're all talking about industrial policy, and it seems like government are completely making this up, and I don't blame them, right? We haven't been functioning under this paradigm, and so we're just sort of trying to understand how to proceed. But the old international context under which, it's not true that the West didn't do industrial policy for decades, it was just different. The US government is hugely involved and has always been in the economy, in various ways. It was different. We've entered a new phase of thinking on industrial policy. And I'd like to go back to Danny Roderick on this, who has written fantastic work on industrial policy. And the way he talks about it is about the solving of information and coordination problems. So in other words, he would like to draw our attention and government's attention, instead of picking winners or taking a strategy like the US government's investment in MP material, that we focus on the ecosystem around businesses, listening to what companies are telling us about, for example, costs of financing that aren't really company specific, so that we can create the context where certain ecosystems can flourish better, rather than trying to sort of pick one company and save it from failure. There's another really interesting article by Gareffi, who's the sort of godfather of the global value chains literature, just published a piece, 2025, reviewing the industrial policy literature and how the West should move forward in this new day and age where, our old sort of paradigms are crumbling around us. So I encourage you to read that too. We should do a second workshop on industrial policy and critical minerals.
Absolutely. I think we're definitely getting there. And I am conscious of the fact that the time for this particular roundtable is coming to a close. And I know we have a couple more questions. If I could encourage to maybe take that during the break rather than in the session. I'm not going to try to summarize this discussion. It has been extremely rich. I think suffice to say that this shows that there's a lot of questions still to explore and to answer, not least about industrial policy and the role of states. I think for certainly a number of countries, and even for many here in Canada, industrial policy was very much out of fashion. Doesn't mean that governments weren't doing them, but they were very much sort of associated as a four-letter word, I think Constantine put it. But now we're in a very different era, and we have to learn and hopefully learn from the experiences of others. I think what we also take away here is that Australia, Japan, Korea, others are doing things that could potentially have an interesting lesson for Canada. We also need to obviously be still in conversations with our partners in Europe and in the US as we think through some of these plurilateral responses. As you mentioned, Pascal, maybe WTO may not be the right framework, but there are others that are emerging. So, but foremost, I think what I'm also taking away from the conversation is that we need to be looking at national interests and looking at whole of Canada approaches to this and having conversations that we're not normally used to having around sort of statecraft and putting interests ahead of other things. We're traditionally been a really good multilateral player. We're very comfortable in the language of the era that is now behind us. We haven't become comfortable and fluent in the emerging narrative and conversations that are unfolding. So I think having these kinds of sessions or convening these kinds of events that bring together academic expertise from across the country, as well as industry expertise and also policymakers from both federal government as well as provincial government, is really critical, and we're happy to be continuing this conversation. So if there were things, themes, questions that emerged for you that you didn't get a chance to contribute, please share them with us as we develop the concept behind this Critical Minerals Hub. If you want to be involved, please be in touch with us as well. My colleagues Karen and Aaron in the room, as well as Charles, will have further information. And if you would like to stay kind of engaged with the work moving forward, one way to do that is also by subscribing to our newsletter. So the kind of the mandatory plug for APFC's Asia Watch that I hope you will all be subscribing to get information about upcoming events. So with that, let me just ask everyone to thank our speakers for sharing all of their insights and for traveling to be with us here today. Thank you very much, Pascal and Constantine.